Welcome back to Understanding Laudato Si. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the second half of Chapter 1 of Pope Francis's encyclical. In the previous video, we looked at three themes, three signs of the time that Pope Francis lifts up for us to consider in the light of the gospel. He told us that one of the most urgent crises we need to consider is that of pollution and climate change. We need to be concerned about water, both in terms of waterborne preventable diseases that cause illness and death to so many people, as well as the fact, he asserts, that water is a basic universal human right. And then finally, he says that we need to be concerned about the loss of biodiversity in our world, both because of the resource depletion that results in, as well as the fact that all these aspects of creation have inherent and intrinsic value in and of themselves. And so a loss of something that we're interconnected with or in relationship to by being part of creation is a problem that needs to be addressed, and we need to respond. In this episode, we'll take a look at the next three themes, these next three signs of the time. The first of these three signs of the time that Pope Francis mentions in the second half of Chapter 1 is the decline in quality of human life as well as the breakdown of society. Now, this is a continuation in a way of Pope Francis's theme of addressing the way in which we culturally view the world and one another in a throwaway manner, what he calls a throwaway culture. He points in a particular way with some scrutiny to technology and to media. He says that, one of the problems that we have today is that digital culture has really stopped some people. It can prevent them from learning to live wisely. What he's getting at here, it seems to me, is that he's concerned about the siloing of people's experience. The way in which that because of technology, because of the internet, because of 24-hour cable news networks that really are concerned about advertising, ratings, and viewership, that they entertain people, that they give people what they want to hear and not the experience of the world as it actually is, or the news that people may not want to see. If something is troubling or difficult or may challenge their own perception or idea of themselves, there's a likelihood that they may switch the channel and watch something else, any one of the many thousands of television channels that are available today. So Pope Francis points to this kind of what I call a siloing, this kind of introspection that's not good, but rather is the reinforcement of blinders that don't allow us to take into consideration the broader world or experience of others. He says that this has caused people to really stop the experience or the process of learning to live wisely, that people don't discern anymore. They just reinscribe what it is they already believe or hold to be true. We see that play out in so many rather unfortunate ways, particularly in our society in the United States. I mentioned in the previous episode that Pope Francis doesn't have any patience or any tolerance for discussion about the possibility that there isn't human effects in global climate change, that this is a scientific fact. It's something that well over 95% of the world's scientists hold in consensus, that they agree upon. It's only in some small pockets that people debate about this stuff, and in the United States, this is one example of where we are way, way, way off the mark, way, way, way in a different place conceptually and culturally from the rest of the world. And that's a problem. The siloing, it contributes to a decline in human life. It contributes in a breakdown of society, as Pope Francis puts it. The next theme or sign of the time that Pope Francis holds up for our examination in light of the gospel is that of global inequality. And it's really here that we see the connection between the environment and global poverty in great, great detail. Pope Francis says that this global inequality, the way that so few, a minority of the population of the globe live so extravagantly and with such comfort and luxury, and the fact that so many people live in poverty is a real problem, and there is a tremendous gap between the two. He also says that it is the poor, the global poor, who most acutely, most painfully, most viscerally experience, in an immediate sense, the real impact, the effects of global climate change and the pollution that we have wrought upon this world. And that, any kind of substantive or thorough environmental response to the crises, whether it be pollution or whether it's climate change, whatever the many issues are that we need to address and face today. He says that in order for it to be integral, in order for it to be kind of wholesome and substantive, it must be and take into consideration a social approach. It has to be a response that incorporates questions of class and of global inequality, questions of economic disparity, the fact that so many suffer while so few gain and benefit and continue to grow wealthy and rich. In other words, as Pope Francis says, borrowing an expression that was, if not coined, made rather famous in a book by the Brazilian liberation theologian and former Franciscan friar Leonardo Boff, Pope Francis says that we must hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And it's here in terms of global inequality that these two things really do come together. The last of these themes, or signs of the time, that Pope Francis presents to us is that which he names the weak responses. He looks back over our history in kind of the recent history, but as well as over the last several centuries, and he says that our responses to these environmental crises have been inadequate. They've been weak. They've been almost non-existent in many circles and in many capacities. He says that we can no longer rely solely on technology to kind of get us out of this problem, out of these circumstances. In no small part, and this is something really he's taking from Pope Benedict XVI. It's something he continues moving forward in the way that his predecessor had highlighted. Pope Benedict, in his own writings, had made clear that technology in and of itself is not a bad, it's not an evil, but our over-reliance on technology, our kind of succumbing to making technology an idol that will solve all of our problems, will be the great panacea of our crises, whether they be economic, whether they be in terms of the environment, whatever it is. This is a real problem. We have to step back and reassess our humility in relationship to the technology that we humans, using the great gifts God has given us, have created. So Pope Francis says that we cannot rely on technology alone to get us out of this crisis, that these problems have been caused in no small part by technologies. Again, he reiterates that technology is not a bad thing in and of itself, but it's not the answer, not by itself anyways, to the problem of environmental degradation, pollution, climate change, and the like. And he says, as he repeats in his homilies and in other venues, as he mentioned in his apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, that we have to move outside of our indifference. Sure, there are some people who are polluting, some people who are contributing in more concrete or explicit ways to the problems of the environment, as well as to the problems of global poverty. He said, but one of the greatest problems is what he identifies as our indifference, our willful ignorance, our lack of care for one another. We need to get out of that. We must move beyond the indifference. He says we must also move beyond in the current economic systems that we have. He says that capitalism is not a good in and of itself either, and that the market economy, the way that we are so reliant on consumption, that we're so reliant on financial practices that benefit the rich and disproportionately negatively affect the poor. He says we have to move beyond this. We have to shift our economic views, because they have consequences for the environment, as we've seen, dating all the way back to the Industrial Revolution and prior, but it also has negative effects in terms of our society when it comes to the gap in the economy, when it comes to a disproportionately negative experience for the poor. He says we have to get outside of this. We can no longer turn a blind eye to the injustices of our economic system. We must also stop dismissing or overly romanticizing and then just kind of putting aside various calls to respond to environmental problems and global poverty in the world. He says that this has been a real issue. It's not something that's often expressed or articulated as clearly, but that oftentimes people talk about the environment or concern for it, and you hear this expression in a derogatory way that, oh, they're just quote-unquote hippies, or they're tree huggers, or whatever it may be. and that those who work for radical environmental justice are often dismissed as being unwell or crazy or something like that, that they're fanatics or some sort of unbridled radicals. And Pope Francis says we have to leave that kind of stereotype aside. This is something that concerns all of us, and we should embrace the need for change. We have to move beyond these kind of stereotypings and name callings that arise. And finally, he says, with regard to these weak responses, that we have to stop pretending that nothing is wrong. There are people who, embrace a willful ignorance. There are people who embrace a sort of willful animosity. But there are people far too often who, in the spirit of indifference, embrace a willful ignorance. I just don't want to know. It's just too overwhelming. It's just too much. I can't be bothered by this. And Pope Francis says that we have to move beyond that. We have to move beyond pretending that nothing is wrong, that we don't have a problem on our hands, because we most certainly do. Otherwise, we're only going to replicate these weak responses that we've already seen, and that can no longer be the case. Pope Francis wraps up chapter 1 with a brief conclusion, and he says in it that though it is the Church's responsibility to call all the members, all Christians, to respond to these challenges, to, as Gaudium et Spes and the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the modern world puts it, we are all called to scrutinize the signs of the time in light of the gospel. Pope Francis admits that the Church is not competent, it is not responsible for expressing and kind of delivering the concrete actions that need to take place. What are these best practices that have to be pursued? Pope Francis says, and rightly so, that there are others, scientists, activists, people who are on the ground, people who have more experience in these areas, who are better suited to help guide us in terms of the concrete actions. What isn't up for grab, though, Pope Francis makes clear, is that we must respond. This is the Church's call, that in light of the gospel, we have to embrace our call to care for the earth, to care for one another, to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So we must respond now. And he invites us to look more deeply into what those possible responses may be, and to not be indifferent, not to be complacent, and to actually act to go forward. As always, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, to like the video, comment below, and give me your feedback, your questions, suggestions for the future. And I also encourage you to share this and the other videos with others. And in St. Francis of Assisi's favorite words of departure, may the Lord give you peace.